The saloon smelled of old whiskey, sweat and rain-soaked dust, the kind of place where hope came to die quietly in the corners. Lamps flickered against smoke-darkened walls, the light catching on boot buckles, gun barrels, and eyes that watched too closely. Laughter had been loud moments earlier, crude and careless, but it thinned and then vanished the instant Jonah Crow stepped inside. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, his coat worn thin at the elbows from years of wind and work. His boots were clean but scuffed, the kind of scuffs earned from long days riding fence lines rather than dancing for show. He did not look at the bar. He did not look at the men drinking. His gaze went straight to the small platform near the back, where a single woman stood beside a table and an open ledger. Clara May kept her spine straight, even as her hands trembled at her sides. She had learned early that weakness invited cruelty. Her dress was faded brown, mended too many times to count, and her hair was pulled back tight, not for beauty, but for survival. She could feel the eyes on her, weighing her like livestock, deciding what she was worth and how long she'd last. The auctioneer had stopped calling bids minutes ago. The price had stalled. Interest was fading. That was the most dangerous moment of all. Someone would take her cheaply, or worse. She'd be sent south with men who didn't bother with papers or promises. Jonah walked the length of the saloon floor, each step slow and deliberate. The floorboards creaked under his weight, the sound loud in the sudden hush. He stopped at the table and reached into his coat. For a moment, Clara's breath caught. She had seen this before. Men reached for money or guns with the same kind of confidence. Jonah placed the coins down one by one. They rang against the wood, silver flashing in the lamplight, a sound that cut through the silence sharper than any shout. When he finished, the pile sat solid and undeniable, more than enough. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose. A murmur rippled through the room. "Well," the auctioneer said, clearing his throat, "seems we have ourselves a buyer after all." Clara stared at the money, her chest tight. She had prayed for this moment and dreaded it in equal measure. Being bought meant living. It also meant belonging to someone else. She lifted her chin and looked at Jonah for the first time. Up close, he didn't look cruel. He looked tired. Lines cut deep around his eyes and mouth, carved there by sun and years of silence. His gaze met hers, steady and unreadable, and something about that unsettled her more than leering hunger ever had. "So," she said, breaking the quiet, her voice low but clear, "you paid for me." A few men snorted. Someone laughed softly. Jonah didn't react. "I paid," he said, "so this ends here." Her lips curved into a sharp, humorless smile. Funny way of ending things. The auctioneer slid the ledger toward Jonah. "Sign here. She's yours." The word hit Clara like a slap. Yours. She felt the room closing in, the walls pressing tighter. She leaned forward, placing her hands on the table, close enough that Jonah could see the faint scars along her fingers, old burns and cuts earned from work no one respected. "Go on," she said, her voice edged with steel. "Don't pretend this is anything but what it is. You paid for me. Now do it." A heavy pause followed, thick as smoke. The men watched eagerly, waiting for Jonah to claim his prize, to prove he was no different from the rest of them. Jonah's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked briefly to the watching crowd, then back to Clara. "I didn't come here for that." She laughed, short and bitter. "They never do until they do." He pushed the ledger back toward the auctioneer, unsigned. "She's leaving with me. That's the agreement." The auctioneer hesitated. "Sir, the terms..." "The terms were money," Jonah said, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that quieted the room again. "You got it." The auctioneer swallowed, then nodded and snapped the ledger shut. "Deal's done." Clara straightened slowly, her heart pounding. "Where exactly do you think you're taking me?" Jonah stood, towering slightly, but he didn't loom. "My ranch." Her eyes narrowed. "And what happens when we get there?" He held her gaze, not flinching. "You'll be safe." Safe. The word sounded foreign, almost laughable. She searched his face for lies and found none she could name. That frightened her more than cruelty ever had. She gestured toward the coins. "You think money buys safety?" "No," Jonah said quietly, "but it can buy time. Time to breathe, time to decide, times she'd never been allowed before. "Get your things," he said, stepping back to give her space. "We're leaving before anyone changes their mind." She hesitated only a second before reaching for the small bundle at her feet, everything she owned wrapped in cloth. As she stepped down from the platform, whispers followed her like shadows. "Crazy fool," someone muttered. "She'll run, or he'll regret it." Clara walked past them all, her head high, though her legs felt unsteady. At the door, she paused and looked back at Jonah. "You know," she said softly, "men who buy women usually expect something in return." Jonah opened the door, letting in a rush of cool night air. "Then it's a good thing I'm not most men." She stepped out into the darkness with him, the saloon door swinging shut behind them, cutting off the noise, the judgment, and the life she had known. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under the moonlight. A horse stamped nearby, tethered and ready. As Jonah helped her up into the saddle, careful and respectful, Clara felt something dangerous stir in her chest. Not hope, something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of a choice. The ranch house stood alone against the wide stretch of land, its silhouette dark and solid, beneath a sky scattered with cold stars. Wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of earth and cattle, a sound so different from the clamor of the saloon that Clara almost felt unsteady stepping into it. Jonah swung down from his horse and led hers to the post, his movements practiced and quiet, as if he were careful not to startle the night itself. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. Inside, the house was simple, a wooden table scarred by years of use, 2 chairs, a small stove that still held warmth, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. An oil lamp burned low, throwing soft light that chased the shadows just enough to make the space feel real, lived in. Safe, perhaps, but safety was something Clara no longer trusted on sight. She stood near the door, her bundle clutched to her chest, waiting. Jonah removed his hat and set it on the table. He shrugged out of his coat, hung it carefully on a peg, and then turned to her. The silence stretched, thick with everything unsaid. She could feel her pulse in her ears, every instinct screaming that this was the moment when kindness ended and ownership began. "You can set your things down," he said gently. She didn't move. Instead, she lifted her chin, her voice edged with challenge and fear. "Is this where it happens?" Jonah frowned slightly. "Where what happens?" "Where you collect," she said. "I didn't forget what I said back there. You paid for me. That kind of money always comes with a price." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing something heavy inside himself. Then he walked past her, not toward the bed, but to the stove. He poured water into a kettle and set it on the heat. "I paid," he said slowly, "because I couldn't stand watching them decide your life like it was a hand of cards." Clara laughed, sharp and defensive. "That doesn't make you noble. It just makes you different." "Different is all I'm aiming for," Jonah replied. He turned back toward her and reached for a folded blanket resting on a shelf. He laid it carefully across the bed, smoothing it with rough hands that had known nothing but work. "You'll sleep here," he said. "I'll take the chair." The words hit her harder than any threat ever had. "That's it?" she asked. "You bring me out here and expect me to believe you're doing this out of kindness?" "I'm not asking you to believe anything," he said. "I'm asking you to rest." Her throat tightened. She didn't remember the last time anyone had offered her rest without demanding something in return. "And tomorrow?" she pressed. "Tomorrow," Jonah said, "you can decide what comes next." She shook her head, pacing a few steps as if the room itself were closing in. "That's not how this works. Men don't buy women to give them choices." Jonah's expression softened, and that somehow hurt more. "I didn't buy a woman," he said. "I bought a chance, for you, and maybe for me too." "For what?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, then answered honestly. "To stop coming home to silence." The admission hung between them, raw and unpolished. Clara studied him again, really looked this time. The way he stood a little apart, as if used to giving space. The weariness that spoke of long days and longer nights. He wasn't pretending to be a hero. He was a man who had been alone for too long and didn't know how to say it any other way. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under her weight. "You're asking me to trust you." "I'm not asking," Jonah said. "I'm offering." She stared at the floor. Memories rising unbidden, hands that grabbed, voices that lied, promises that rotted the moment they were spoken. Her fingers tightened around her bundle until her knuckles whitened. "If I stay," she said slowly, "it won't be because you paid." "Good," Jonah replied. "I wouldn't want it to be." That night passed in uneasy quiet. Jonah sat in the chair, boots still on, hat pulled low over his eyes. Clara lay awake on the bed, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, waiting for it to change. It never did. At some point, exhaustion claimed her, and she slept deeper than she had in years. Morning came with pale light spilling through the window and the sound of movement. Clara sat up sharply, fear flashing through her before she saw Jonah at the stove, stirring something that smelled warm and filling. "Coffee," he said over his shoulder. "And eggs, if you like." She swung her legs over the side of the bed, confusion replacing fear. "You cook too?" "I eat," he said dryly. "Cooking's part of that." They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was cautious, respectful. Afterward, Jonah pushed a folded paper across the table. "What's this?" Clara asked. "A deed," he said, "to the south pasture. It's not much, but it's land. If you decide to leave, you won't leave with nothing." Her breath caught. "You just give it to me." "I'd rather you stay because you want to," Jonah said. "Not because you're trapped." Days followed, slow and unfamiliar. Clara learned the rhythms of the ranch, the early mornings, the steady work, the way Jonah spoke more to the land than to people. He taught her how to mend fences, how to ride without fear, how to read the sky for signs of weather. In return, she brought laughter back into the house, warmth into corners that had long gone cold. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the fields gold, Clara stood beside Jonah on the porch. "You know," she said softly, "you didn't just save me." He glanced at her. "No, you chose me," she said, "when you didn't have to." Jonah's hand hovered between them, hesitant. "And you stayed." She reached for him then, closing the small space that had remained. Her touch was gentle but sure. "I stayed because you never once made me feel owned." The valley would later whisper its own version of the story, twisting it into something simple and sensational. But the truth was quieter. A man who paid to set a woman free, a woman who chose to stay. And somewhere between the dust and the silence, they found themselves standing side by side, not buyer and bought, but husband and wife, bound not by silver but by choice.